In an article from Ars Technica, deep in the heart of Texas, collapsing power grid. Everything in Texas went wrong at once. So if you are interested in the recent power outages in Texas, this is definitely an article you should check out. I am interested in this article because I live in Houston, Texas, and I've been without power and water for several days, and it's been extremely inconvenient. And of course, that type of thing is going to happen every once in a while. We deal with this during hurricanes and whatnot. However, this is extremely widespread. This is the entire state of Texas where these outages are taking place, and everyone's really scratching their heads. How did this happen? And so we've got this article here from Ars Technica, which I feel like is a pretty reliable source of unbiased information. And it says here, Texas is now entering its third day of widespread power outages, and although supplies of electricity are improving, they remain well short of demand. For now, the state's power authority suggests that rather than restoring power, grid operators will try to shift from complete blackouts to rolling ones. Meanwhile, the state's cold weather is expected to continue for at least another day. How did this happen? And I'll just tell you, based on what I've read, I went through this entire article, and in summary, Texas has an isolated grid that cannot lean on its neighbors if needed, and there is less regulation. So this is a primary reason why they've had issues. So apparently the rest of the United States has two major power grids, and if there's a part of the U.S. that is, experiencing bad weather and they need help with a little bit more power, they can pull that from other locations. But Texas being completely isolated from the two major power grids, that really is a large reason. And then perhaps the lack of regulation ensuring that the source of generation or the different sources of generation are prepared for this type of weather could have some impact on it as well. Now, of course, you can't blame them entirely because this is somewhat of a rare event, but not extremely rare. And so that's one reason. Additionally to that, all of the sources of power generation were affected by the cold weather. So when you're looking at wind and solar, they were affected by the ice. But since they are not expected to be big generators in the winter, they did not have a large impact on this situation. However, the next source of generation, natural gas. Now, this had a very large amount of degradation and impact due to energy providers competing with consumers for natural gas and the pipes freezing up for the natural gas. And so that's the primary reason for this outage here. And then finally, even the nuclear power plants apparently had some issues with freezing water. So that, there's different aspects of a plant that need water, and they were not totally prepared for that. So yeah, those are probably the three or four main reasons. It's the isolation of the grid, and it's the lack of winterization for all sources, and primarily natural gas is the major source of power generation, and it suffered the most degradation. All right, so those are the main reasons there. If you look through here, it goes on to give more details. Why is Texas so much worse off? And it says here, while other states have seen customers lose power, Texas has been hit the hardest, with far more customers losing power for substantially longer. One key reason for this is because Texas maintains its own power grid, largely in isolation from those of its neighbor states. In North America, most customers are served by two major grids that operate on the same alternating current frequency, one serving the eastern half of the continent, including the US, Canada, and parts of Mexico, and the other serving the western half. However, Texas, along with Quebec, both maintain power grids that are largely separate from these larger networks. Okay, and it goes into more details about that. And then we got here, how did a cold snap trigger this crisis? The typical power demand profile in Texas would show a big peak in summer when most of the state has to run air conditioning 24 hours a day to keep its inhabitants from melting. Because of this, power generators schedule needed maintenance and upgrades for the winter months, when demand is generally lower. As a result, the Texas grid is less able to match spikes in demand during the winter. So they kind of do maintenance in the winter usually. However, it goes on to say down at the bottom, but even if reserves and economics had all kicked in, as in if they were already prepared for this, like to use maximum production, Texas wouldn't have avoided problems because generating sources were shutting down left and right, essentially saying even if everything was at full capacity and not shut down for maintenance, they would have ran into problems because of the winterization of all of these sources of power generation, like the pipes freezing up for the natural gas. What shut down in Texas? Pretty much everything, though for different reasons. Wind turbines iced up and stopped generating, cutting into the grid contribution of renewable power. But wind and solar don't produce as much power during the Texas winter under normal circumstances. So the loss of some capacity there wasn't as much a problem as it may have been in summer. They weren't expected to produce much anyway. Okay, but then it goes to talk about the natural gas and how it's competing against the power suppliers are competing against the consumers for natural gas because people are also using that for heat generation directly. All right. And then shouldn't Texas have been ready for this? Yes and no. It depends on how you define this, because they go into talk about the weather and how often this happens. There was a similar occurrence apparently in 2011, so it's not extremely rare, but it does happen, but not very often. All right, so definitely a good article to check it out. You want to read through here and see, read the details on this to kind of have some backup details on the reasons for. But in summary, it's the isolated grid in Texas, and it's the lack of winterization of the power generation supplies, most importantly, natural gas.